Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Polaris-Live. This is your host, Sarwar Kashmeri, inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of conversations with global experts on the US-China relationship. This program is brought to you in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. My distinguished guest today is Mr. Shuja Nawaz. He is a distinguished fellow and founding director, Atlantic Council South Asia Center. Shuja Nawaz, a native of Pakistan, was made the first director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council in January 2009. He is a prolific writer. He's written 5 books. The latest book is The Battle for Pakistan, The Bitter U.S. Friendship and a Tough Neighborhood. And we'll talk about that in a moment. He's written articles in all the leading media, including the New York Times, Boston Globe, International Herald Tribune, Washington Post Foreign Affairs. He speaks on current topics before civic groups, at think tanks, on radio and television. He's worked on projects with RAND, the United States Institute of Peace, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the Atlantic Council, and other leading think tanks on projects dealing with Pakistan and the Middle East. Of both areas, he has a tremendous understanding. In January 2009, he was made the first director of the South Asia Center at the Atlantic Council of the United States. Prior to working here in Washington, he worked with the Ministry of Planning, Government of Pakistan, International Atomic Energy in Vienna, the World Health Organization, and he always reminds me that he started as a copy boy at the New York Times. He's written 2 books of verse, believe it or not, Journeys and the Inner World. So would you join me, please, in welcoming Shuja Nawaz to Polaris-Live. Assalamu alaikum, Shuja Nawaz. How are you? Welcome.
Well, walaikum assalam. Thank you, Sarwar. It's good to see you.
Shuja, always a pleasure to see you. And you're part of my early education in South Asia. I remember it fondly at the Atlantic Council. But listen, let's start with your latest book, right? The Battle for Pakistan. And you mentioned on the cover and inside that it showcases a marriage of convenience between unequal partners, the U.S. and Pakistan. What do you mean by that, Shuja?
Well, let me show you the book first, because there are 2 versions of it.
Oh, wow. Wow.
This is the American version,
Yes.
produced by Roman Littlefield. It's an updated version of the original that came out in September 2019 from Penguin Random House in India for South Asia. And then a Pakistan edition came out later that year. So these are the 2 versions. The US edition.
Look at the first version you showed again. Yeah. That looks like a drone on the cover.
It is.
Yes.
It's a drone, and this version is updated because it came out later. It was just that Penguin Random House did such a fantastic job of getting the book from manuscript to print that before we had a US publisher, the South Asia edition was out. So,
fantastic!
So the covers were different then. But it was a fun project, and having lived in the United States since 1975, for most of the time, except for my brief trips once to Pakistan to work with Mahbubul Haq in the Planning Commission in the 80s, and then from 1999 to 2001. With Mohammed al-Baradei at the IAEA in Vienna, I've been deeply entrenched in Washington life and politics and observing it, and have friends and contacts throughout the city. So I felt that the U.S.-Pakistan relationship deserved to be studied. And the original title of my book was Misalliance, which you remember from your reading of George Bernard Shaw's play
Yes,
is a
indeed.
marriage between unequal partners.
Yes, but how do you use that with the America and Pakistan?
Well,
I
it's
mean,
very unequal in terms of power as well as wealth, as well as the relationship. It tends to go one way and then the other way, and then there's constant complaining and carping on both sides, and there's a layer of mistrust, unfortunately. And yet they are codependent, largely because of events that occur in the region where they have come together over the years.
right,
So it's been a bit of a roller coaster, which
right.
is what happens in such marriages of convenience.
But let me ask you. It sounds like in the last few years, the relationship seems to have just gone down and hasn't taken an upswing yet. Would you agree with that?
Generally, yes, except on one issue, which is that it has been so Afghanistan centric
Yes,
that, particularly with the US desire to exit from its longest war, Pakistan continues to play a role. And now, particularly since there is almost no aid going to Pakistan, the security relationship between the two militaries, the US and the Pakistan military, is primarily now hinging upon what the Pakistanis can do to use whatever influence they have with the Taliban to get a reasonable settlement and an exit for the United States as
okay,
soon as possible.
before we go there, Shuja, I wanted to ask you that in spite of this daggers drawn relationship between America and Pakistan, the United States wouldn't be able to fight the Afghan war unless Pakistan allowed all the material to land in Karachi, its Arabian seaport, and then be trucked through Pakistan to Afghanistan, right? So, in spite of wherever this relationship has gone, Pakistan has been the central way that America's fought in Afghanistan. Is that
Yes,
right?
and I cover that in some depth in my book
Uh-huh.
because what happened was that periodically, when there would be a contretemps between these two allies, so-called allies, the Pakistanis would shut the ground line of communication, the G-lock, as they called it in military acronyms. And then the US had to find other ways, and they found a way through Russia and Central Asia.
Right.
But there's a price for that because, particularly when you're moving goods by air, it's about 14 times the cost of moving them by sea and ground through Pakistan.
Indeed.
The other less understood element was the airline of communication, because the United States had access to Afghanistan's airspace only through Pakistani airspace, and this was from the get go, from the invasion of Afghanistan throughout the war.
Right.
Iran was obviously verboten, so that airspace couldn't be used. And there was an airbase in Central Asia at a place called Manas, which was then shut down because of Russian influence. So the US really had to rely on and continued to rely on the A-lock, as it's called. And very smartly and cleverly, the Pakistanis never shut that down
Ah.
because they didn't want to rupture this relationship.
Right. Was there? So there's a question from a viewer, Shivja, that fits in very nicely here, and he tells us that in the 60s, there was a Chinese attack on India, right? And the U.S. seems to have played a very constructive role by asking Pakistan to not take advantage of what was happening on the other side with Pakistan. And that apparently America brought some pressure to bear on China to say, let's cool it, don't go in any further. But then he says India now is being courted as an ally by the US. Pakistan and America are daggers drawn, and China is hugely more powerful now than it was then. So how is this? Can America play any kind of a role, Pakistan, China, because it seems to all be starting again?
A little correction in the history from our colleague who's entered this discussion through the web,
Sure.
the US had no influence in China, with China in the 60s. So it would be incorrect to say that they put pressure on China to do something. The US, in fact, reacted to a move by then President Ayub Khan of Pakistan, who wanted to offer a no war pact to India at that time,
Right.
an offer which was spurned. But the US unilaterally, even though it was a public ally of Pakistan, unilaterally set into motion an aid flow, which was extremely swift and powerful to India, to send India equipment and material that would help it defend itself against any potential Chinese incursion into India proper. This has been captured very nicely in a book by Bruce Rydell, a slim volume which I would recommend to people. So this was kind of the background to that. Yes, of course, today China is on the border with both Pakistan and India. Pakistan settled its border dispute with China, exchange of territory in the north, which India obviously disputes. And then with India, there have been these border clashes, some of them deadly, but no resort to heavy use of military weaponry. And that, I think, has been the saving grace. And the way I explain this is that India and China are also now codependent in terms of trade. The India-China trade is north of $100 billion a year, and in fact is larger than the US-India trade if you take out services as a component of that total. And so I think, some years ago I was at the Infosys headquarters, and I discovered that the Indian call center giant Infosys and others were outsourcing some of their work to Chinese counterparts because their wages were lower than the Indian wages. So there are these elements of economics, I think, that are going to help resolve many of these issues.
So, Shuja, as you know, we started this program with the Foreign Policy Association, Polaris-Live, to sometime later this year publish a report recommending some proactive ways that America could lessen its tension with China. We'll come to that towards the end, but what I want to ask you now is, do you think that China, I'm talking now about the Belt and Road Initiative, right? $65 billion China intends to invest in Pakistan, literally change the economy by building dams and roads and highways and power plants and so on. I talked to a previous central bank governor in Pakistan when I was writing my last book, and he told me that because of what China is doing, the exporters now get more energy, more electricity, and there's some early returns on it. What can you tell us about the BRI? Is it really working? A lot of visibility? Has it made already a substantial difference? Can you shed some light on that, Shuja?
Certainly, I can try. The BRI, or the One Belt, One Road Initiative, is China's grand plan to connect it to the world.
Yes.
And to have multiple points of access to not just the warm waters of the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea and the Indian Ocean, but also to Europe. Their first element in this was to try and capture the trade and the flow of natural resources from the Central Asian republics that had previously flown west towards Moscow, that they could create opportunities for them to flow east into China to feed China's need for
Pakistan. Is it working in Pakistan?
Now, for Pakistan, it was a very necessary and important element to create an economic corridor. which would not just benefit Pakistan, but would benefit China in the long run, because it would allow China, among other things, to use Pakistan as a corridor as well as an entrepot, because it could produce goods in Pakistan and thereby reduce its transportation costs and give Pakistan opportunities to produce material with Chinese partners and maybe even with Western partners, which is something I want to mention now, because this way they could reach the Middle East and Africa, the littoral states of the Indian Ocean, much easier than having to go through the long and arduous path through the Indian Ocean and through the Straits of Malacca, which could always be interrupted. So the $65 billion that you're talking about is a 30-year time frame with a heavy front-end loading of infrastructure projects, which Pakistan needs, infrastructure and energy. And Pakistan has done well, at least in sorting out some of its energy problems, but not all of them, particularly the circular debt that they have. And they are now also looking at using some of their coal, which may not be a good idea in the long run for environmental reasons, but at least for the short run will give them some respite from having to import energy from abroad.
Accusation, Shuja, that Pakistan is getting into debt with this and that this is just a Chinese plan to lend more money and Pakistan, won't be able to pay it back and so on. Any truth to that?
Well, this is an allegation that has been made. The Pakistanis have, particularly because of the pandemic, a good reason now to sit down with their Chinese counterparts to reevaluate some of the deals, to make sure that they don't put an onerous burden on Pakistan in terms of repayment or for the government guarantees that may have been necessary for some of the direct investment that is taking place in Pakistan. As a result, particularly of the pandemic, the work on some of the projects has slowed down considerably, and I think this will be an important period during which this will be recalibrated. One should remember, Sarwar, that the Chinese are very far-sighted and they don't put all their eggs in one basket. Even though this was seen as a game changer in Pakistan, and the Chinese see this relationship as long-lasting, and they respect Pakistan's role as one of the few windows for them to the world outside from the early 70s and connecting them with America, they also have a much bigger investment deal with Iran, which will give them an alternative route to the Persian Gulf, and that's a $400 billion investment in total. So gas and oil pipelines, so they can get resources from Iran through Central Asia into China. And of course, they have investments in Afghanistan.
Of course. And Shuja, caught on Twitter just 2 or 3 days ago that Pakistan's Prime Minister Imran Khan has congratulated President Xi Jinping for raising much of China's population over the poverty level, which they announced in their meetings last week. My question is, Shuja, is there a way you can tell us what the average Pakistani on the street thinks of Chinese versus Americans?
The average Pakistani thinks of the Chinese as a better friend than the Americans. And this has been something that I cover in my book. It's been because of the way the governments in Pakistan have mishandled the relationship with the United States. They have lied to the people of Pakistan consistently about what was happening between the government and the United States. So you were talking about the drone on the cover of my US edition. The drone attacks were a very good example of that. Those were sanctioned by the government of Pakistan. The drones targeting of of targets inside what used to be known as the federally administered tribal area, FATA, on the border with Afghanistan, was quite often done in conjunction with and from sites located in Pakistan, uh, with the military of Pakistan collaborating with the US. But the
Right.
people of Pakistan were told that this is terrible, the US shouldn't do it. And so there was created an upswell of anti Americanism in Pakistan, which has made it very difficult for the government of Pakistan to have an open relationship and a productive relationship with
Right.
America. I want to share with you just one thing. The Pew polls that have been conducted over the years have consistently shown that the people of Pakistan see America as the largest single threat to Pakistan,
Wow.
because there are fears that it'll come and take over the nuclear weapons of Pakistan and the assets of Pakistan, and it will destroy Pakistan somehow in collaboration with India or Israel or whatever.
And so this issue of the Quad, the so-called Quad, where
Yes.
America is building this grouping with India and Japan and Australia, Pakistan must view this as just a continuum of that threat.
Well, it sees the US as tilting towards India.
Right.
But in my view, Pakistan should not be too worried about the Quad, because the Quad is really designed for the Indo Pacific.
Right.
It is not Western facing. And Pakistan should be able to shape its own neighborhood and to shape the environment with India, with Iran, with China, with Afghanistan in a manner that will benefit Pakistan. Uh, but just to complete my sharing with you about the Pew polls, there's another question that the Pew people used to ask, and that was, uh, do you want improved relationship between Pakistan and the United States? And more than 60% of the respondents to that question said yes. And that question has never been unpacked.
Wow.
So the people in Pakistan don't want the relationship to go south. The military doesn't want the relationship to go south because they value American training and American weaponry, even though they get the volume from China.
Yes.
The higher quality stuff they get from America, and that's now been stopped.
And it makes a great, you just remind me that I have come across a number of senior officers at the U.S. Army War College when I've spoken there and attended some seminars. And it was fascinating to talk with them and the affection that they develop with the American military. So I understand a little bit what you're saying. But I have another question from our viewers, and this person asks, do you think the Biden administration will have any effect on the Pakistani-American relationship? What do you think?
Absolutely. And the reason I say that is that I worked very closely with the Obama administration and within the Obama administration with Vice President Biden and his team. I had the privilege of briefing him a couple of times, once at his home, once in the White House. And I had not met a more informed leader on
Wow.
the region, and particularly on Pakistan, in the last decade. So Joe Biden knows the region, he knows the people in the region, and he can see through them. So you can't push anything past him. Tony Blinken knows the region. He's been with Joe Biden as foreign policy advisor. And then when he was the vice president, Hera Mustafa, the Kurdish American who is currently the ambassador in Bulgaria, she was the director for South Asia. And we were in constant contact. And these are people that know what is happening there. They know who is doing what to whom and with what effect. And so it'll be a much more informed decision making. It won't be based on 3 a.m. tweets.
So, Shuja, as we start getting into the final segment of this program, I'm going to ask you to stretch your powerful brain just a little bit and see if you can tell us a couple of things that America can do with China to start thawing this tiff? Because I mean, these are the two superpowers, and God knows we have world problems that only these two can attack. They have the resources. So I'm going to ask you for that. And as a subtext of it, if Pakistan can play a role in what you're suggesting, and I think this way we can lead also into the topic of America leaving Afghanistan, which we started some minutes ago. But I'd really like your thoughts on some 10,000 foot large projects that America and China can start together.
Well, first off, I think Pakistan offers a great opportunity for joint investments because Pakistan badly needs to rebuild its infrastructure, particularly its communications. There is a huge Chinese investment already in the port of Gwadar.
Right.
$200 million was spent by a Chinese firm to develop that port, but it is not connected to the rest of the country and the hinterland. And one of my regrets was that during the period that I was with the Atlantic Council and talking to the US government, I failed to convince them that it was important for them to set up infrastructure that would connect Gwadar to through Balochistan, through Quetta to Chaman and into Afghanistan, because that would link Afghanistan and Pakistan and allow Afghanistan much easier, smoother access for its access to the Arabian Sea and for trade and for imports and exports. This never happened. The Chinese have now offered to do some building of infrastructure there.
Right.
But unfortunately, and I hope this decision will be reversed, the first decision inside Pakistan, and this may have some military thinking behind it, is to kind of isolate and cordon off Gwadar for security reasons. In my view, it would be better to open it up and connect it through Balochistan and involve the Baloch in that process in such a way that the resources from Balochistan can reach the sea.
Right.
It's a huge mining area. The Chinese have investments there.
And they've also all along that they're not getting their due from what the government is doing, right? So what you're saying will also help in that area.
Yes, the center-periphery relationship will be strengthened by doing this kind of work. Now, there were two routes in the Chinese-Pakistan economic corridor. There was the Western corridor and the Eastern corridor. Right. And the government of Pakistan, unfortunately, talked about the Western corridor, but did nothing about it. The Chinese said that we won't be investing in that corridor, you do that. The Pakistanis said yes, and they haven't done it. They've invested everything in the Punjab and Sindh, and not in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa Balochistan corridor that would take them to Gwadar.
So are you heading, sorry, I'm interrupting you again. It's a very bad habit of commentators, interviewers, Shuja. But are you also saying that if America was to do that, think about investing, that might also let America and China in some way work together in planning and maybe help thaw some of this dip? Or am I not reading you right?
No, this is exactly what I'm saying. And in fact, Pakistan is now actively looking and discussing with the Chinese in ways in which American firms can bid on some of the infrastructure projects under the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor scheme. So for the next 30 years, there's an opportunity. But unfortunately, US aid has taken off and away from infrastructure projects.
Oh, wow.
And so they've had almost a kind of religious dictum about not doing infrastructure. Whereas when you look at the history of the US-Pakistan relationship, the best and the most successful projects that the Pakistanis proudly point to are all the major infrastructure that the United States gave China, beginning with the very first nuclear training reactor in Nellore near Islamabad, beginning with the Mangla Dam and the Tarbela Dam, which are responsible for providing energy to most of the country, building the Lahore University of Management Sciences, rebuilding the Foreman Christian College in Lahore, and so on and so forth. Any number of activities which are visible and are signature projects of the United States and the people of the United States assisting the people of Pakistan.
Right. It's, well, Shuja, you and I could go on talking about this for a long time, and we're a little beyond the time that I wanted to for us to talk. You've been kind to stay for a few minutes longer. I cannot tell you how much I'm sure all of us have learned for it. I have another note here from the person who'd asked the question, saying to thank you for being responsive to his question. And so let me, at this point, thank you very much for appearing on this program. You're always welcome to come back, and I know you will often, because you will write many more books, which is what you are so good at doing. So please, thank you for your time, Shuja.
Thank you, Sarwar, and thank you to your viewers.
Well, listen, it was such a pleasure, and I want to tell our viewers now, I'm sorry we've run out of time. Please go to my website, kashmiri.com, and you will see a list of people who will be appearing as guests throughout this month and the next. And join me next Tuesday for another episode of Polaris Live. Until then, goodbye.